Welcome to a journey through time and mystery. As you settle into comfort and prepare for rest, let these ancient tales wash over you like gentle waves upon a distant shore. Tonight we explore the deepest mysteries of biblical history, stories that have echoed through millennia, carrying with them the whispers of the divine and the unexplained. Allow your mind to drift as we venture into realms where the physical world touches something far greater, where ordinary people encountered the extraordinary and where the boundaries between heaven and earth grew thin. These are not merely stories, but windows into moments when the veil between worlds was lifted, revealing truths that continue to inspire wonder and contemplation. As your breathing deepens and your body relaxes, let these mysteries unfold in your consciousness like flowers blooming in the darkness of night. In the twilight hours of biblical history, when shadows grew long and the world seemed suspended between day and night, extraordinary events unfolded that would reshape the understanding of the divine. These moments, scattered across centuries like stars across the night sky, share a common thread of mystery and wonder that continues to captivate the human spirit. The ancient lands of Israel and Judah were no strangers to the supernatural. In those days, when the boundary between the seen and unseen worlds seemed thinner, people lived with an acute awareness of the divine presence that moved through their daily lives. The hills and valleys of the Holy Land bore witness to countless encounters between mortals and the eternal, each event adding another layer to the rich tapestry of faith and mystery. As empires rose and fell around them, the people of these lands carried stories that transcended politics and warfare. These were tales that spoke to something deeper in the human experience, touching upon our most fundamental questions about life, death, and the nature of existence itself. Each mystery we explore tonight represents a moment when ordinary reality was transformed by the touch of the divine, leaving witnesses forever changed and historians forever puzzled. The chronicles of these events were preserved not merely as historical records, but as testimonies to experiences that defied explanation. They speak of visions that revealed hidden truths, of encounters with beings from beyond the mortal realm, and of displays of power that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. These stories have survived the centuries precisely because they continue to resonate with something deep within the human soul. Our journey begins in a time of great turmoil, when a kingdom stood on the brink of destruction and its king, consumed by desperation, sought answers from sources he had once forbidden. This was an era when the old order was crumbling, when the familiar patterns of life were giving way to uncertainty and fear. In such times, people often turn to the mysterious, seeking guidance from realms beyond their understanding. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for revelation. Ancient olive groves whispered secrets to the wind, while the stones of Jerusalem's walls absorbed the prayers and lamentations of a people caught between hope and despair. It was in this atmosphere of supernatural expectancy that the first of our mysteries unfolds, a tale that would echo through the ages as a testament to the lengths to which desperation can drive even the mightiest of rulers. King Saul stood at the precipice of his reign, watching as his kingdom slowly dissolved around him. The Philistines had gathered their armies like storm clouds on the horizon, their bronze weapons glinting in the sun as they prepared for what many believed would be the final battle for the land of Israel. Saul's own forces were vastly outnumbered, and with each passing day, more of his warriors deserted, slipping away in the darkness to avoid what seemed like certain death. The king's nights had become an endless torment of wakefulness and worry. He would pace the floors of his palace, his footsteps echoing hollowly through chambers that once rang with laughter and celebration. The weight of the crown felt heavier with each passing hour, pressing down upon him like a physical burden that threatened to crush his very spirit. In his desperation, Saul had tried every conventional means of seeking divine guidance, but the heavens seemed closed to him, offering only silence where once there had been clear direction. The prophets who had once spoken words of encouragement now avoided his presence, and even the sacred lots used for divination provided no answers to his desperate questions. It was as if the divine had turned its face away from him, leaving him to navigate the approaching storm without any guiding light. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his situation, for a king who could no longer hear the voice of his God was a king who ruled in darkness. As the Philistine threat grew more imminent, Saul's advisors spoke in hushed tones about surrender or flight, options that the king found impossible to contemplate. His pride, his duty to his people, and his deep-seated belief in his divine appointment all rebelled against such courses of action. Yet without guidance from above, he felt like a ship caught in a tempest, tossed about by forces beyond his control or comprehension. It was in this state of profound desperation that one of Saul's servants approached him with information that would change the course of events. The servant spoke in whispers, glancing nervously around the chamber, as if afraid that the very walls might betray his words. He told the king of a woman in the village of Endor, a woman who possessed abilities that few dare to speak of openly. She was said to have the power to commune with the spirits of the dead, to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of shadows. The irony was not lost on Saul that he, who had once issued strict edicts against such practices, was now considering turning to the very arts he had banned from his kingdom. The law was clear that consultation with mediums and necromancers was forbidden, punishable by death. Yet here he was, contemplating exactly such a course of action, driven by a desperation that overwhelmed all other considerations. Under the cover of darkness, disguised as a common traveller, Saul made his way to the village of Endor. The journey through the night-shrouded countryside felt surreal, as if he were already crossing into the realm of shadows and mysteries. The familiar landmarks of his kingdom looked strange and alien in the moonlight, transformed by the unusual nature of his mission into something from a dream or nightmare. The Witch of Endor lived in a modest dwelling on the outskirts of the village, hidden among gnarled olive trees that seemed to whisper secrets to one another in the night breeze. When Saul and his companions approached her door, she was immediately suspicious, for visitors at such an hour rarely brought good news. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, despite her advanced years, studied the disguised king with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his careful deception. Initially, the woman refused to perform the necromancy that Saul requested, fearing that it might be a trap designed to test her loyalty to the king's own laws. She spoke of the dangers that faced those who practiced such arts, reminding her visitors of the recent purges that had driven most mediums and fortune-tellers from the land. Her caution was understandable, for the penalty for practicing witchcraft was severe, and she had survived this long by being extremely careful about whom she trusted. Only when Saul swore a solemn oath that no harm would come to her did the woman agree to attempt the summoning he desired. Even then, she moved with the careful deliberation of one who understood the gravity of what she was undertaking. The consultation with the dead was not a matter to be approached lightly, for it involved forces that even the most experienced practitioners treated with the utmost respect. The chamber where the ritual took place was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of burning herbs and incense, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of normal time and space. As the woman began her incantations, her voice took on a quality that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her physical being, resonating with harmonics that made the very air vibrate with otherworldly energy. The transformation that came over the medium was profound and unsettling. Her ordinary features seemed to blur and shift, as if she were becoming a conduit for forces from another realm. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites were visible, and when she spoke, it was in a voice that carried the weight of centuries. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and the flames of the oil lamps flickered and danced as if stirred by unfelt winds. What happened next would become one of the most debated and mysterious events in biblical history. The medium's reaction to whatever she saw was one of pure terror. She let out a scream that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, a sound of such primal fear that it froze the blood of everyone present. Her entire body trembled as she pointed toward a space in the chamber that appeared empty to the eyes of Saul and his companions. Through her terror, the woman managed to speak, her words tumbling out in a rush of fear and recognition. She saw an old man ascending from the earth, she said, wrapped in a robe that seemed to shimmer with otherworldly light. The description she provided left no doubt in Saul's mind about the identity of the spirit that had been summoned. It was Samuel, the prophet who had anointed Saul as king so many years before, the same Samuel who had later pronounced divine judgment upon him. The presence of Samuel's spirit filled the chamber with an authority that was unmistakable. Even though Saul could not see the apparition directly, he could feel its presence like a weight pressing down upon the very air around him. The temperature continued to drop, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen and take on a life of their own, reaching toward the living with fingers of darkness. When the Spirit spoke, its words carried the same prophetic authority that Samuel had wielded in life, but now enhanced by the terrible wisdom of death. The message was not one of comfort or hope, but rather a confirmation of Saul's worst fears. The Spirit pronounced that the kingdom would indeed be torn from Saul's hands, that he and his sons would die in the coming battle, and that Israel would fall to the Philistines. The prophetic words fell upon Saul like hammer blows, each sentence driving him deeper into despair. There was no offer of redemption, no possibility of changing the predetermined course of events. The divine judgment that had been pronounced upon him during his lifetime was now confirmed by the voice from beyond the grave, sealed with the finality that only death could provide. The physical effect of the revelation on Saul was immediate and devastating. The king, who had entered the chamber seeking hope and guidance, found himself face to face with the absolute certainty of his doom. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor as if the very life force had been drained from his body. The weight of the prophecy seemed to crush him physically as well as spiritually. The medium, still shaken by her encounter with the spirit world, showed unexpected compassion for the fallen king. Despite the terror she had experienced, she recognized the profound suffering of the man before her and offered him what comfort she could. She prepared food for Saul and his companions, understanding that they would need strength for the dark journey that lay ahead of them. As dawn approached and the supernatural atmosphere of the night began to fade, Saul and his men prepared to leave the dwelling of the Witch of Endor. The king's disguise now seemed almost pointless, for he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had already died, whose fate had been sealed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The prophecy would indeed prove accurate, for within days Saul and his sons would fall in battle against the Philistines, marking the end of his troubled reign. The encounter at Endor stands as one of the most mysterious and controversial episodes in biblical history. It raises profound questions about the nature of death, the possibility of communication with the deceased, and the extent to which divine judgment can be escaped or altered. The story has puzzled theologians and scholars for centuries, offering various interpretations but no definitive answers. Some have suggested that what the medium saw was not truly the spirit of Samuel, but rather a demonic deception designed to torment Saul in his final hours. Others maintain that the divine allowed the actual spirit of the prophet to return with a message of judgment, using even forbidden practices to accomplish divine purposes. Still others propose that the entire event was an elaborate psychological phenomenon, born of Saul's desperate need for guidance and the medium's skillful manipulation of his expectations. What cannot be disputed is the profound impact that the encounter had upon all those present. The medium herself was clearly shaken by what she experienced, suggesting that whatever occurred was beyond her normal range of supernatural activities. Saul's reaction, too, speaks to the reality of the experience from his perspective, for his physical and emotional collapse was too genuine to be attributed to mere theatrical effect. The story of the Witch of Endor resonates through the ages as a testament to human desperation and the lengths to which people will go when seeking answers to life's most pressing questions. It reminds us that there are mysteries in existence that transcend our understanding, realms that exist beyond the boundaries of normal human experience, and forces that operate according to laws we can barely comprehend. As the echoes of this first mystery fade into the mists of time, our journey through biblical enigmas continues. The thread that connects these ancient tales is not merely their supernatural content, but their ability to reveal truths about the human condition that remain relevant across the centuries. Each mystery builds upon the last, creating a tapestry of wonder that speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart. From the desperate necromancy of a doomed king, we turn our attention to another realm of mystery entirely, one that involves not the communication with the dead, but rather a vision of the living divine that challenged every assumption about the nature of heavenly reality. This next chapter in our exploration of biblical mysteries takes us to the banks of a distant river, where a priest in exile experienced a revelation that would reshape religious understanding for all time. The river Chebar flowed through the flat plains of Babylonia like a silver ribbon cutting through the golden expanse of grain fields and irrigation canals. Along its banks, thousands of Jewish exiles had made their homes, creating communities that preserved their culture and faith despite being far from the promised land of their ancestors. These were people who had been torn from everything familiar, forced to adapt to a foreign culture while maintaining their identity as the chosen people of the one true God. Among these exiles lived a priest named Ezekiel, a man whose life had been forever altered by the catastrophic events that had befallen Jerusalem. He had been trained in the temple service, educated in the sacred traditions, and prepared for a life of ritual worship in the holy city. Instead, he found himself ministering to a displaced people in a land of foreign gods and unfamiliar customs, struggling to maintain faith in circumstances that seemed to deny everything he had been taught about divine providence. The 30th year of Ezekiel's life found him standing on the banks of the Chebar, contemplating the waters that reflected the vast Babylonian sky. It was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's exile, a time when the full weight of their displacement had settled upon the Jewish community like a heavy cloak. The initial shock of exile had given way to a deeper melancholy, a profound sense of abandonment that coloured every aspect of daily life. Ezekiel had been wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. How could the God who had promised to dwell among his people allow the destruction of his temple? How could the covenant relationship survive when the chosen people were scattered among the nations? These were not merely theological puzzles, but existential challenges that struck at the very heart of his faith and identity. On this particular day, as Ezekiel stood in contemplation by the riverside, the ordinary world around him began to transform in ways that defied all natural explanation. The first sign of the approaching vision was a change in the quality of light itself. The familiar golden glow of the Babylonian sun seemed to intensify and take on a different character, becoming charged with energy that made the very air seem to vibrate with expectation. From the north, a great cloud appeared on the horizon, unlike any weather formation that Ezekiel had ever witnessed. This was not the ordinary accumulation of water vapour that brings rain to thirsty lands, but rather a supernatural phenomenon that pulsed with inner fire and lightning. The cloud moved with purposeful direction, growing larger and more magnificent with each passing moment, as if it were actively approaching rather than simply drifting with the wind. As the extraordinary cloud drew nearer, details became visible that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. Lightning flashed continuously within its depths, not the random electrical discharge of natural storms, but organized patterns of illumination that seemed to follow some cosmic choreography. The fire within the cloud was not the familiar orange and yellow of earthly flames, but rather a brilliant white light that hurt to look upon directly, yet possessed a beauty that made it impossible to turn away. The sound that accompanied this celestial phenomenon was unlike anything in Ezekiel's experience. It was not the simple rumble of thunder, but rather a complex symphony of harmonics that seemed to carry meaning beyond words. The very ground beneath his feet vibrated in response to these otherworldly tones, creating a sensation that he felt not just in his ears, but throughout his entire being. As the vision continued to unfold, Ezekiel became aware of movement within the fiery cloud, shapes that gradually resolved into forms that bore some resemblance to living creatures, yet were unlike anything that existed in the natural world. These beings appeared to be constructed of elements from various earthly creatures combined in ways that suggested a reality governed by different laws than those that applied to ordinary existence. Each of the 4 living creatures possessed characteristics that seemed to embody different aspects of creation. They had the faces of humans, suggesting intelligence and consciousness, but also the faces of lions, representing strength and majesty. The faces of oxen spoke of service and sacrifice, while the faces of eagles suggested the freedom and perspective that comes from soaring above earthly limitations. These multiple faces were not arranged in any pattern that made sense according to normal anatomy, yet somehow appeared perfectly natural within the context of the vision. The wings of these creatures were perhaps even more extraordinary than their faces. Each being possessed 4 wings that moved with perfect coordination, creating currents of air that seemed to carry more than mere physical force. 2 wings were used for flight, moving with a rhythm that generated harmonious tones, while the other 2 wings covered their bodies in a gesture that spoke of reverence and humility before the divine presence. Beneath each creature, or perhaps integrated with them in ways that defied normal spatial relationships, were wheels that rolled along the ground without apparent regard for the direction the creatures were facing. These wheels were not simple circular objects, but complex constructions covered with eyes that seemed to observe everything simultaneously. The movement of the wheels followed the will of the creatures, suggesting a unity of purpose that transcended mechanical connection. The most remarkable aspect of these wheel creatures was their apparent consciousness. The eyes that covered their surfaces were not merely decorative elements, but seemed to function as organs of perception, watching and evaluating everything within their range of vision. This suggested that the vision involved not merely strange objects, but actual beings possessed of intelligence and awareness, entities that existed at the intersection of the physical and spiritual realms. Above the heads of the living creatures stretched what appeared to be a firmament or platform of crystal, transparent yet solid, catching and reflecting the brilliant light that suffused the entire vision. This crystalline expanse served as a foundation for what lay above, providing a stage upon which the ultimate revelation of the vision would unfold. The sound of the creature's wings striking against this firmament created music that seemed to come from the very foundations of reality. Upon this crystal platform stood a throne, but not a throne constructed of any earthly material. This seat of authority appeared to be carved from sapphire, a blue so deep and pure that it seemed to contain within itself all the mysteries of the heavens. The throne was not merely furniture, but a manifestation of cosmic authority, representing the rulership that extends over all creation and transcends all earthly power structures. The figure who occupied this throne challenged Ezekiel's ability to describe what he was witnessing. The vision showed the appearance of a man, yet this was humanity glorified beyond all earthly limitations. From the waist up, the figure appeared to be made of metal that glowed with inner fire, while from the waist down, the appearance was of pure flame. This combination of elements suggested a being who partook of both the strength of metal and the dynamic energy of fire, unified in a form that somehow remained recognizably human. The most overwhelming aspect of the throne vision was the light that surrounded the divine figure. This was not the simple illumination that comes from any physical source, but rather the fundamental radiance from which all other light derives its existence. It created a rainbow effect in the clouds that surrounded the throne, colours that seemed more vivid and pure than any that exist in the natural world, hues that carried emotional and spiritual impact beyond their visual beauty. The impact of this vision upon Ezekiel was immediate and profound. The priest, who had been trained in the formal worship of the temple, found himself overwhelmed by this direct encounter with divine glory. His body could not remain upright in the presence of such overwhelming majesty, and he fell face down upon the ground, his human consciousness barely able to process what he was witnessing. Yet even as Ezekiel lay prostrate before the vision, he heard a voice speaking to him with clarity that cut through his confusion and fear. The voice addressed him not with condemnation for his weakness, but with a commission that would transform his role among the exiles. He was called to stand upright, to receive words that would need to be transmitted to his people, to become a bridge between the divine realm he was witnessing and the human community that needed to understand its significance. The spirit that had revealed itself in this magnificent vision entered into Ezekiel, filling him with strength and purpose that transcended his natural capabilities. This was not a temporary empowerment, but a fundamental transformation that would enable him to serve as a prophet to his generation and to all future generations who would hear his words. The vision was not merely a private religious experience, but the beginning of a prophetic ministry that would span decades. As the immediate intensity of the vision began to subside, Ezekiel found himself changed in ways that would affect every aspect of his subsequent life and ministry. He had been granted a glimpse into the mobile throne chariot of the divine, understanding that the God of Israel was not confined to the destroyed temple in Jerusalem, but could manifest his presence anywhere in the world. This revelation transformed the entire meaning of exile, showing that separation from the promised land did not mean separation from divine presence. The symbolism of the vision spoke to truths that extended far beyond the immediate circumstances of the Babylonian exile. The four living creatures represented the fullness of creation, acknowledging divine authority, while their wheels suggested that this authority was not static but actively involved in the movements of history. The eyes that covered the wheels spoke of divine omniscience, the awareness that encompasses all things and misses nothing of significance. The crystal firmament represented the transparency of divine justice, while the sapphire throne symbolized the unshakable nature of divine authority. The fire that surrounded the divine figure spoke of purification and judgment, while the rainbow that crowned the vision reminded viewers of divine mercy and the covenantal faithfulness that survives even through times of judgment and exile. This vision of Ezekiel has inspired artists, theologians, and mystics throughout the centuries, each generation finding in its imagery new depths of meaning that speak to their own circumstances and challenges. The complexity of the vision has led to numerous interpretations, some focusing on its immediate historical context, others exploring its cosmic and eschatological implications. What remains constant across all interpretations is the sense that this vision represents an encounter with ultimate reality, a glimpse into the workings of divine providence that normally remain hidden from human perception. The vision suggests that behind the apparent chaos and suffering of historical events, there operates a divine intelligence and purpose that encompasses all things and works toward ultimate justice and restoration. The mobility of the divine throne chariot became particularly significant for subsequent generations of believers who found themselves displaced or persecuted. The vision assured them that divine presence was not limited to any particular geographical location or physical structure, but could manifest itself wherever faithful people gathered to seek divine guidance and comfort. As Ezekiel's extraordinary vision fades into the river mists of ancient Babylon, our journey through biblical mysteries continues to unfold like a scroll being opened to reveal its hidden contents. The connecting thread between these supernatural encounters becomes clearer with each story, showing us that the divine presence manifests itself in times of crisis and transition, offering both judgment and hope to those who encounter its power. Our next mystery transports us from the banks of the Chebar to the gleaming palace of Babylon itself, where the height of human pride and power was about to encounter divine authority in a most dramatic and unforgettable way. The setting is a royal banquet hall filled with the most powerful nobles of the greatest empire on earth, where wine flows freely and arrogance knows no bounds. King Belshazzar reclined upon his throne, surveying the magnificent feast that he had prepared for 1,000 of his nobles. The great banquet hall of the Babylonian palace glittered with gold and silver vessels, many of them sacred treasures that had been plundered from the temple in Jerusalem decades earlier. The irony of using these holy implements for a pagan celebration was not lost on the king, who took perverse pleasure in demonstrating the complete dominance of Babylon over all the nations of the earth. The wine was flowing freely, loosening tongues and inflaming passions as the evening progressed. Courtiers competed with one another in composing elaborate praises for their king and their gods, while entertainers performed feats designed to amuse and astound the assembled dignitaries. The air was thick with incense and perfume, creating an atmosphere of intoxicating luxury that seemed to transport the revellers beyond the ordinary concerns of mortality. Belshazzar himself had been drinking heavily, his judgment clouded by wine and the intoxicating effects of absolute power. In his alcohol-induced bravado, he made a decision that would transform the evening from mere celebration into divine confrontation. He commanded his servants to bring forth the golden and silver vessels that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple of the God of Israel, intending to use them for toasts to the Babylonian deities. The servants hesitated momentarily, understanding the sacred nature of these vessels, and perhaps sensing that their use in such a context was inappropriate. However, the king's word was absolute, and within minutes the holy implements that had once been used in the worship of the one true God were being filled with wine and distributed among the pagan nobles of Babylon. The sacrilege was complete, and the celebration reached new heights of blasphemous excess, as the nobles raised the sacred vessels to their lips, drinking wine while praising gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. The very air in the banquet hall seemed to change. The laughter became more forced, the music more discordant, as if the entire celebration was beginning to ring hollow. Some of the more sensitive individuals among the guests felt a growing uneasiness, though they could not identify its source. The king himself was in the midst of proposing yet another toast to his favourite deity, when something happened that froze the wine in his throat and stopped his words in mid-sentence. Near the great lampstand that illuminated the hall, fingers of a human hand appeared in the air, moving with deliberate purpose across the plastered wall. The fingers were not attached to any visible body, yet they moved with unmistakable intelligence and intent. The supernatural hand began to write upon the wall, inscribing characters in what appeared to be Aramaic script. The letters formed slowly and deliberately, as if the invisible writer wanted to ensure that every mark was clearly visible to all present. The handwriting itself was unlike any earthly script, glowing faintly with its own light and seeming to burn itself into the plaster as if inscribed by fire. The effect upon the assembled nobles was immediate and profound. Conversations ceased mid-sentence as hundreds of eyes turned toward the miraculous writing on the wall. Wine cups slipped from nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor and staining expensive garments with red liquid that now seemed ominously reminiscent of blood. The entertainment stopped abruptly as musicians and dancers joined the guests in staring at the supernatural phenomenon. Belshazzar's own reaction was perhaps the most dramatic of all. The king, who had been boasting of his power and the might of his gods, suddenly found himself face to face with a force that rendered all earthly authority meaningless. His face drained of colour, becoming as pale as the plaster upon which the mysterious hand continued to write. His entire body began to tremble uncontrollably, and his knees knocked together with such violence that he could barely remain upright upon his throne. The writing on the wall consisted of 4 words, inscribed in characters that seemed to pulse with otherworldly significance. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The words appeared to be in Aramaic, a language familiar to the Babylonian court, yet their meaning in this context was far from clear. They hung upon the wall like a divine riddle, challenging the assembled wisdom of the greatest empire on earth to decipher their significance. As soon as the supernatural hand had completed its message, it vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving behind only the glowing letters on the wall as evidence of its existence. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of the king's laboured breathing and the distant noise of wine still dripping from overturned cups onto the marble floor. Belshazzar, struggling to regain his composure and assert his authority in the face of this inexplicable phenomenon, called loudly for his advisers and wise men. His voice, which had been booming with confidence just moments before, now carried an unmistakable tremor of fear. He demanded that his enchanters, soothsayers, and astrologers be summoned immediately to interpret the meaning of the mysterious writing. The wise men of Babylon hurried into the banquet hall, their long robes rustling as they approached the wall where the supernatural inscription glowed with undiminished intensity. These were men renowned throughout the empire for their learning and wisdom, experts in the interpretation of omens and the deciphering of mysterious phenomena. Yet as they studied the writing on the wall, their faces reflected the same confusion and fear that had seized the king and his guests. Despite their vast knowledge and experience, the Babylonian wise men found themselves utterly unable to explain the meaning of the 4 words that had been written by the supernatural hand. They could read the individual characters, they could even pronounce the words, but the significance of the message in its present context remained completely beyond their understanding. Their failure to provide an interpretation only deepened the sense of dread that had settled over the banquet hall. In his desperation, Belshazzar offered extravagant rewards to anyone who could successfully interpret the writing on the wall. He promised that such a person would be clothed in purple, would receive a golden chain around his neck, and would be made the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. These were honours typically reserved for the highest nobles of the realm, yet the king was willing to bestow them upon anyone who could provide answers to the riddle that had transformed his celebration into a nightmare. Despite the magnificent rewards being offered, none of the assembled wise men dared to attempt an interpretation. They understood that to provide a false or inadequate explanation might result in their execution, while to admit their ignorance was to reveal the limitations of their vaunted wisdom. The silence stretched on, becoming more oppressive with each passing moment as the supernatural writing continued to glow upon the wall like an accusation written in fire. It was at this moment of crisis that the Queen Mother entered the banquet hall, drawn by the commotion and the obvious distress of her son the king. This wise woman had lived through the reigns of previous Babylonian rulers and possessed a longer historical memory than most of the current court. She immediately recognized that this situation was beyond the capabilities of the ordinary palace advisors and recalled a man who had served with distinction in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. The Queen Mother reminded Belshazzar of Daniel, the Jewish exile who had risen to prominence during his grandfather's reign through his ability to interpret dreams and unravel mysteries that confounded all other wise men. She spoke of Daniel's exceptional gifts, describing him as a man in whom dwelt the spirit of the holy gods, possessing knowledge and understanding that surpassed all earthly wisdom. Her words carried the weight of personal experience, for she had witnessed Daniel's remarkable abilities firsthand. Daniel was summoned to the banquet hall, making his way through the crowd of anxious nobles with the dignity and composure that had characterized his long career in the Babylonian court. Though he was now advanced in years, his bearing still reflected the confidence that comes from a lifetime of faithful service to the one true God. He approached the wall where the supernatural writing glowed, studying the inscription with eyes that had seen many divine revelations throughout his lengthy exile. Before attempting to interpret the mysterious writing, Daniel addressed the king with words that carried both respect for royal authority and fearless commitment to divine truth. He declined the offered rewards, stating that gifts and honours meant nothing in the face of eternal judgment. This response immediately established that Daniel's interpretation, whatever it might be, would not be influenced by personal gain or fear of royal displeasure. Daniel's interpretation began not with the mysterious words themselves, but with a historical reminder of what had happened to Belshazzar's grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. He recounted how the great king had been humbled by divine judgment, driven from human society to live like a wild animal, until he acknowledged that the Most High rules over the kingdoms of men and gives them to whomever he wills. This history lesson served as a preface to understanding the current crisis. The prophet then turned his attention to Belshazzar himself, pointing out that despite knowing this history, the current king had chosen to lift himself up against the Lord of heaven. The use of the sacred vessels from the Jerusalem temple for the worship of pagan gods represented not merely political conquest, but spiritual rebellion against the divine authority that governs all earthly kingdoms. This act of sacrilege had triggered the supernatural response that now confronted the assembled court. With this context established, Daniel proceeded to interpret the 4 words that had been written by the supernatural hand. Mene, he explained, meant that God had numbered the days of Belshazzar's kingdom and brought it to an end. The repetition of the word emphasized the certainty and finality of this divine judgment. The time of grace had expired, and the countdown to destruction had reached its conclusion. Tekel, the second word in the inscription, meant that the king had been weighed in the divine balances and found wanting. This was not a judgment based on earthly standards of success or failure, but rather an evaluation according to divine justice that took into account the moral and spiritual dimensions of royal authority. By this ultimate standard, Belshazzar's reign had been measured and found to be lacking the essential qualities that legitimate earthly rule. Upharsin, the final word, conveyed the most dramatic aspect of the divine judgment. It meant that the kingdom would be divided and given to the Medes and Persians, the very enemies who were at that moment besieging the walls of Babylon. The empire that had seemed invincible, the kingdom that had conquered all its neighbours and accumulated unimaginable wealth and power, was about to be destroyed and its territories distributed among foreign rulers. The interpretation that Daniel provided was not merely a prediction of future events, but a revelation of divine judgment that was already in the process of being executed. The writing on the wall was not a warning that could be heeded and the consequences avoided, but rather an announcement of what was already decreed in the councils of heaven. The supernatural hand had written not a conditional threat, but an irrevocable sentence. Despite the terrifying nature of Daniel's interpretation, Belshazzar commanded that the prophet be honoured according to the promise that had been made earlier in the evening. Daniel was clothed in purple and received a golden chain around his neck, and was proclaimed the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. These honours, however, would prove to be remarkably short-lived, for the divine judgment announced by the supernatural writing was about to be fulfilled with stunning swiftness. That very night, as the echoes of the banquet still lingered in the palace halls, the armies of Cyrus the Persian breached the defences of Babylon through an ingenious strategy that diverted the waters of the Euphrates River. The city that had been considered impregnable fell without a prolonged siege, its walls proving useless against an enemy that approached from an unexpected direction. The The conquest was so swift and complete that many of the inhabitants awoke to find themselves under foreign rule. Belshazzar himself perished in the chaos of that night, his life ending just hours after he had witnessed the supernatural writing that foretold his doom. The kingdom that had seemed eternal was dissolved in a single evening, its territories redistributed exactly as the mysterious inscription had predicted. The golden vessels that had been used in the blasphemous toast were returned to their proper purpose, eventually making their way back to Jerusalem when the exiles were permitted to return to their homeland. The mystery of the writing on the wall has resonated through history as one of the most dramatic examples of divine intervention in human affairs. The supernatural hand that appeared in the banquet hall represented a direct challenge to human pride and earthly power, demonstrating that even the mightiest empires exist only by divine permission and can be dissolved when they overstep the boundaries of divine tolerance. The story speaks to the universal human tendency to mistake temporary success for permanent security, to confuse earthly power with ultimate authority. Belshazzar's use of the sacred vessels represented more than mere insensitivity. It symbolized the human attempt to subordinate the divine to human purposes, to treat the sacred as merely another tool for advancing worldly agendas. The supernatural nature of the writing itself has been the subject of extensive theological and philosophical discussion. Some have interpreted it as a direct divine intervention, while others have suggested that it represents the operation of spiritual laws that govern the rise and fall of nations. What cannot be disputed is the profound impact that the event had upon all who witnessed it, transforming a celebration of human achievement into a confrontation with ultimate reality. The precision with which the prophecy was fulfilled adds to the mystery of the event. The interpretation provided by Daniel proved accurate in every detail, from the timing of the kingdom's fall to the identity of its conquerors. This accuracy suggests that the writing on the wall was indeed what it appeared to be, a genuine revelation of divine knowledge that transcends ordinary human understanding. As the mystery of Belshazzar's feast dissolves into the shadows of fallen Babylon, our journey through biblical enigmas continues to weave together themes of divine power, human mortality, and the thin boundary between this world and the next. The thread that connects these stories becomes ever more apparent, showing us that the supernatural intrudes upon ordinary life most dramatically when human pride reaches its pinnacle and divine patience reaches its limit. From the fallen palace of Babylon, we turn our attention to a much different setting, a humble village in Palestine where the greatest mystery of all was about to unfold. This next chapter in our exploration takes us to a place where death itself would be challenged, where the boundaries between life and mortality would be crossed in a way that would forever change human understanding of what lies beyond the grave. The village of Bethany nestled among the rocky hills just outside Jerusalem like a jewel set in a rough crown. Its narrow streets and simple stone houses bore witness to centuries of quiet existence, where generations of families had lived and died in the shadow of the holy city. The inhabitants of Bethany were ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen who lived simple lives, yet their village would become the setting for one of the most extraordinary events in human history. Among the residents of this modest community lived a family that had become particularly dear to Jesus of Nazareth during his ministry in Judea. Mary, Martha, and their brother Lazarus had opened their home to the travelling teacher, providing him with rest and refreshment during his journeys throughout the region. Their household had become a place of refuge where Jesus could escape the constant press of crowds and the increasingly hostile attention of the religious authorities in Jerusalem. Lazarus himself was a man beloved not only by his sisters, but by the entire community of Bethany. His gentle nature and generous spirit had endeared him to neighbours and strangers alike, making him one of those rare individuals whose presence seemed to brighten any gathering. His friendship with Jesus had deepened over time, growing from initial curiosity about the young rabbi's teachings to genuine affection and mutual respect. The illness that struck Lazarus came suddenly and with devastating force. What began as a minor complaint quickly escalated into a serious condition that left him bedridden and growing weaker by the hour. His sisters, both skilled in the healing arts of their time, tried every remedy they knew, but nothing seemed to slow the progression of the mysterious malady that was consuming their brother's strength. As Lazarus's condition worsened, Mary and Martha found themselves facing the terrible prospect of losing the brother who had been the centre of their small family circle. The house that had once echoed with laughter and animated conversation fell into an atmosphere of hushed concern, where every breath and movement was monitored for signs of change. Friends and neighbours gathered to offer what help they could, but it became increasingly clear that human assistance would not be sufficient to save Lazarus from whatever force was claiming his life. In their desperation, the sisters made the decision to send word to Jesus, who was known to be teaching somewhere across the Jordan River. The message they sent was simple yet eloquent in its brevity. Lord, he whom you love is sick. These few words carried within them not only information about Lazarus's condition, but also an implicit plea for divine intervention, a recognition that their situation had moved beyond the realm of ordinary human remedies. The messenger who carried word of Lazarus's illness to Jesus travelled through the Judean wilderness with urgent haste, understanding the gravity of his mission. The journey across the Jordan and back would require precious time that might mean the difference between life and death for the beloved brother of Mary and Martha. Every hour that passed brought new anxiety to the household in Bethany, where the patient's condition continued to deteriorate despite all efforts to help him. Jesus' response to the news of Lazarus' illness was unexpected and difficult for his disciples to understand. Rather than immediately setting out for Bethany, he remained where he was for 2 additional days, continuing his teaching ministry as if nothing urgent had occurred. When questioned about this delay, Jesus spoke mysteriously about the illness not being unto death, but for the glory of God, words that confused his followers and would not be fully understood until later events revealed their deeper meaning. During those 2 crucial days while Jesus remained across the Jordan, the condition of Lazarus in Bethany took its inevitable course. Despite the loving care of his sisters and the prayers of the community, the mysterious illness that had struck him proved stronger than all human efforts to combat it. On the 2nd day after the messenger had departed for Jesus, Lazarus breathed his last, leaving Mary and Martha to face the terrible reality of his death. The death of Lazarus sent shockwaves through the small community of Bethany, where he had been universally loved and respected. Neighbours who had watched him grow from childhood to manhood gathered to offer comfort to his grieving sisters and to participate in the mourning rituals that would honour his memory. The house that had been filled with hope for divine intervention now echoed with the sounds of lamentation and loss. Following the customs of their time and culture, the body of Lazarus was carefully prepared for burial, wrapped in linen cloths with spices and aromatic herbs, designed to preserve it and mask the odours of decomposition. This process was carried out with tender care by family members and close friends, each fold of the burial cloth representing both love for the deceased and acceptance of the finality of death. The body was then placed in a tomb carved from the living rock, a cave sealed with a heavy stone that would mark the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. For 4 days, Lazarus lay in the tomb while life in Bethany slowly began to adjust to his absence. Mary and Martha received a steady stream of visitors, offering condolences and sharing memories of their departed brother. Many of these mourners had travelled from Jerusalem, drawn by their affection for the family and their desire to provide comfort during this difficult time. The presence of so many friends served as a testament to the impact that Lazarus had made during his lifetime, but it also emphasized the permanence of the loss that had befallen his sisters. The Jewish understanding of death held that the soul remained near the body for 3 days after death, but departed permanently on the 4th day. This belief meant that by the time 4 days had passed, Lazarus was considered to be thoroughly and irrevocably dead, beyond any possibility of recovery or resuscitation. The grieving process could now move forward without false hope, and the community could begin the long work of adjusting to life without one of its most beloved members. It was at this point, when death had established its apparent victory and hope had been laid to rest alongside the body in the tomb, that Jesus finally arrived in Bethany. His approach to the village was noticed first by the mourners who had gathered around the house of Mary and Martha, many of whom recognized the teacher who had been a frequent visitor to the household during happier times. Word spread quickly through the crowd that Jesus had finally come, though his arrival seemed tragically delayed. Martha, upon hearing that Jesus was approaching, immediately left the house and went out to meet him on the road leading into Bethany. Her first words revealed both her continued faith in his power and her deep sorrow over what appeared to be his failure to arrive in time to help. She expressed her conviction that if Jesus had been present, her brother would not have died. Yet even in her grief, she maintained her belief that God would grant him whatever he requested. The conversation between Jesus and Martha that followed became one of the most significant theological discussions recorded in the Gospels. When Jesus assured her that her brother would rise again, Martha replied with the conventional Jewish belief in a general resurrection at the end of time. However, Jesus' response transcended these traditional expectations, declaring himself to be the resurrection and the life, and stating that whoever believed in him would live even though they died. This declaration represented a fundamental shift in understanding about the nature of life and death. Jesus was claiming not merely to have power over death, but to embody the very principle of life itself. His words suggested that biological death was not the final reality for those who placed their faith in him, that there existed a form of life that transcended the physical limitations that bound ordinary human existence. Mary, who had remained in the house with the mourners, was summoned by Martha to come and meet Jesus. When she arrived, she fell at his feet with the same expression of faith and sorrow that her sister had voiced, convinced that Jesus' presence during Lazarus' illness would have prevented the tragedy that had befallen their family. The sight of her tears, combined with the weeping of the Jewish mourners who had accompanied her, moved Jesus to a profound emotional response. The reaction of Jesus to the grief he witnessed was complex and deeply human. The Gospel records that he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, suggesting an emotional response that went beyond simple sympathy. Some have interpreted this as anger at the destructive power of death and its effect upon those he loved, while others see it as a manifestation of the divine compassion that entered fully into human suffering. When Jesus asked to be shown where Lazarus had been laid, the mourners led him to the tomb, a cave sealed with a stone according to local burial customs. It was here, standing before the sealed entrance to the realm of the dead, that Jesus displayed the most human of emotions. The shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, captures a moment of profound vulnerability in which the divine nature expressed itself through genuine human tears. The tears of Jesus had a powerful impact on those who witnessed them, confirming for many the depth of his love for Lazarus and his genuine participation in human grief. However, some among the crowd questioned why someone who had opened the eyes of the blind could not have prevented the death of his friend. This criticism revealed the natural human tendency to judge divine actions by human standards, expecting immediate intervention rather than trusting in purposes that might transcend immediate understanding. Standing before the tomb, Jesus commanded that the stone be rolled away from the entrance. This request met with immediate objection from Martha, who pointed out that after 4 days the body would have begun to decompose and would produce a terrible odour. Her practical concern reflected the natural human resistance to confronting the harsh realities of death and decay, but it also demonstrated the thoroughness with which death had apparently claimed its victim. Despite Martha's objections, Jesus insisted that the stone be removed, reminding her of his earlier promise that if she believed, she would see the glory of God. The men present reluctantly complied with his request, rolling away the heavy stone to reveal the dark interior of the tomb. The opening of the tomb represented a reversal of the burial process, a symbolic movement from death back toward life that foreshadowed what was about to occur. With the tomb now open, Jesus lifted his eyes toward heaven and offered a prayer that was heard by all present. He thanked the Father for hearing him and acknowledged that he prayed aloud for the benefit of the crowd so that they might believe that he had been sent by God. This prayer established the theological context for what was about to happen, making it clear that the miracle would serve not merely as an act of compassion, but as a sign pointing to divine authority and mission. After completing his prayer, Jesus called out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." The command was simple, yet carried with it the full authority of divine power over death itself. His words penetrated the silence of the tomb, reaching into the realm where Lazarus had resided for 4 days, calling him back across the boundary that separates the living from the dead. The response to Jesus' command was immediate and unmistakable. From within the dark recesses of the tomb came the sound of movement, the rustling of burial cloths, as something stirred within the chamber that had been silent for 4 days. Then, to the amazement of everyone present, a figure appeared at the entrance of the tomb, wrapped in the linen cloths of burial, but unmistakably alive and moving. Lazarus emerged from the tomb, still bound in his burial wrappings, his hands and feet wound with strips of linen, and his face covered with a cloth according to Jewish burial customs. The sight of him standing at the threshold between death and life, still wearing the garments of the grave, yet obviously alive and responsive, created a moment of stunned silence among the witnesses. Here was something that transcended all their understanding of the natural order, a reversal of death so complete and dramatic that it challenged every assumption about the permanence of mortality. Jesus' final command was practical yet symbolic. Loose him and let him go. The burial cloths that had been wrapped around Lazarus for his journey into death now needed to be removed so that he could fully rejoin the world of the living. This unwrapping process represented not just the physical restoration of Lazarus, but his complete return to normal human existence, freed from every vestige of his encounter with death. The impact of witnessing Lazarus' resurrection from the dead was profound and varied among those who saw it happen. Many of the Jewish mourners who had come from Jerusalem to comfort Mary and Martha immediately believed in Jesus, recognizing in this miracle a demonstration of divine power that transcended all their previous experience. The resurrection of Lazarus provided them with concrete evidence that Jesus possessed authority over the ultimate enemy of humanity, death itself. However, the miracle also created significant political and religious complications. Some of the witnesses hurried back to Jerusalem to report what they had seen to the Pharisees and other religious authorities, understanding that this event would have major implications for the ongoing conflict between Jesus and the established religious hierarchy. The resurrection of Lazarus represented a claim to divine authority that could not be ignored or explained away through conventional means. The raising of Lazarus from the dead stands as perhaps the most dramatic of all the miracles attributed to Jesus during his earthly ministry. Unlike healings of diseases or disabilities, which might be attributed to natural recovery or psychological factors, the resurrection of a man who had been dead for 4 days required a direct confrontation with the reality of death itself. This miracle demonstrated power over the fundamental boundary that limits all human existence. The theological implications of Lazarus' resurrection extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of the event. It served as a preview of the ultimate victory over death that would be accomplished through Jesus' own resurrection, providing his followers with a tangible demonstration that death need not be the final word in human existence. The miracle also illustrated the compassionate love that motivates divine intervention in human suffering, showing that God's power is exercised not arbitrarily, but in response to genuine need and faith. The mystery of what Lazarus experienced during his 4 days in the tomb has intrigued believers and skeptics alike throughout the centuries. Unlike other accounts of resurrection in religious literature, the Gospel narrative provides no description of Lazarus's subjective experience of death or his journey back to life. This silence may be intentional, suggesting that some aspects of the encounter between life and death transcend human language and understanding. The story of Lazarus also raises profound questions about the nature of resurrection itself. Was his return to life simply a restoration of his previous physical existence, or did it involve a transformation that prepared him for a different kind of life? The narrative suggests that Lazarus resumed his normal place in the community, but it also implies that his experience of death and resurrection marked him in ways that would have lasting significance. As the echoes of the great miracle at Bethany fade into the landscape of memory, our journey through biblical mysteries prepares to enter its most apocalyptic dimension. The restoration of life to one man in a small Palestinian village points forward to cosmic events that would affect all of creation, visions of ultimate judgment and transformation that would close the biblical narrative with images of both terror and hope. From the tomb where death was conquered, we turn our attention to the island of Patmos, where an aging apostle received visions that would shake the foundations of history itself. These final mysteries in our exploration reveal not individual encounters with the supernatural, but cosmic movements that herald the end of one age and the beginning of another, events that dwarf even the most dramatic biblical miracles in their scope and significance. The rocky island of Patmos lay like a jewel of suffering in the azure waters of the Aegean Sea, its harsh landscape bearing silent witness to the countless exiles who had been banished to its shores by Roman imperial justice. Here, among the wind-swept cliffs and barren hills, political prisoners and religious dissidents served their sentences far from the civilizations they had supposedly threatened. It was to this place of isolation and hardship that the aging Apostle John had been sent, condemned for his persistent preaching of the gospel despite imperial prohibitions. John had outlived all the other apostles, his longevity both a blessing and a burden, as he watched the first generation of Christian believers pass away one by one. His exile to Patmos represented the Roman Empire's attempt to silence one of the last living links to Jesus himself, removing him from the communities where his testimony carried such powerful authority. Yet the Romans had unwittingly created the perfect conditions for the reception of the most extraordinary visions in biblical history. The island's isolation provided John with the solitude necessary for deep spiritual contemplation, while its harsh beauty served as a fitting backdrop for visions of cosmic judgment and transformation. The constant sound of waves crashing against the rocky shores created a natural rhythm that seemed to attune the exiled apostle's spirit to receive communications from beyond the ordinary world. Here, far from the distractions of civilization, the aged disciple prepared to receive revelations that would echo through eternity. On the first day of the week, as John was deep in prayer and meditation, the boundary between earth and heaven suddenly dissolved around him. The Spirit of God took hold of him with irresistible power, lifting his consciousness beyond the confines of his physical existence on the barren island. What followed was a series of visions so magnificent and terrible that they challenged the very limits of human language to describe. Among the most vivid and terrifying of these visions was the appearance of 4 horsemen whose ride would herald the beginning of the end for the current world order. These were not ordinary riders on ordinary horses, but cosmic forces given tangible form, avatars of divine judgment that would sweep across the earth with unstoppable power. Each horseman represented a different aspect of the divine wrath that would precede the establishment of God's eternal kingdom. The first horseman appeared mounted on a white horse, its coat gleaming with supernatural purity that hurt to look upon directly. The rider himself was arrayed in garments of blinding whiteness, carrying a bow that seemed to be crafted from materials not found on earth. Upon his head sat a crown that radiated authority, marking him as a conqueror whose victories were predetermined by divine decree. This horseman was given power to go forth conquering and to conquer, representing the irresistible advance of divine purposes through human history. Some interpreters have seen in this first rider a representation of Christ himself, going forth to claim the world for his kingdom through the preaching of the gospel. Others have identified him with the spirit of conquest that drives human ambition and empire building, the relentless expansion of power that characterizes so much of human history. The white horse might symbolize either the purity of divine victory or the deceptive righteousness that often masks human aggression. The ambiguity surrounding the identity of the first horseman reflects the complex nature of divine action in human affairs. The same force that brings salvation to some may bring judgment to others, and the advancement of divine purposes often involves the overthrow of existing power structures. The crown worn by this rider suggests legitimate authority, yet the bow he carries implies that this authority will be established through conflict rather than peaceful submission. As the vision continued to unfold, the second horseman appeared on a horse the colour of fire, its red coat seeming to glow with inner heat like molten iron fresh from the forge. This rider was given a great sword and the power to take peace from the earth, ensuring that humanity would turn upon itself in an orgy of violence and destruction. The red horse and its rider represented the spirit of war and civil strife that would consume nations and kindreds, brother rising against brother in conflicts that would make previous wars seem like mere skirmishes. The sword carried by this second horseman was not an ordinary weapon, but a symbol of the divine authority to judge and execute judgment upon the earth. The power to remove peace from human society represented a withdrawal of divine restraint, allowing the violent tendencies that lurk within human nature to manifest themselves without limitation. This horseman's mission was not to create violence where none existed, but to remove the spiritual and moral barriers that normally prevent human conflicts from escalating to their ultimate extremes. The vision of the red horse and its rider spoke to the universal human experience of war and its devastating consequences. Yet this was war raised to a cosmic level, conflict that would involve not merely armies and nations, but the fundamental spiritual forces that govern human existence. The removal of peace from the earth would create conditions in which the true nature of human rebellion against divine authority would be fully revealed. The third horseman rode a black horse, whose darkness seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflecting it, creating an aura of shadow that moved with the creature as it advanced across the vision's landscape. This rider held scales in his hand, the ancient symbol of commerce and measurement, but these scales would measure scarcity rather than abundance. The black horse represented famine and economic collapse, the breakdown of the systems that provide for human physical needs. From somewhere near this dark rider came a voice announcing the price of basic foodstuffs in terms that revealed desperate scarcity. A day's wage would purchase only a small portion of wheat or barley, barely enough to sustain life for a single person. Yet the voice also commanded that oil and wine should not be harmed, suggesting that luxury items would remain available to those with sufficient wealth, while basic necessities became increasingly scarce for the masses. This selective scarcity represented more than mere economic hardship. It symbolized the moral corruption that accompanies the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few while the majority suffer want. The scales carried by the third horseman would weigh not only grain and gold, but also the justice and equity of human societies. The black horse's mission was to expose the fundamental selfishness that underlies much human economic activity. The vision of famine and economic collapse that accompanied the third horseman resonated with the experiences of John's original audience, who lived under Roman rule and understood how quickly prosperity could turn to want when political and social systems failed. Yet the cosmic scale of this vision suggested hardships that would exceed any merely local or temporary difficulties, representing a global crisis that would affect all human societies simultaneously. The fourth and final horseman appeared mounted on a pale horse, its sickly colour suggesting disease and decay rather than the healthy vitality associated with living creatures. This horse and its rider represented the ultimate enemy of all human existence, death itself, given tangible form and sent forth to claim its final harvest from the earth. The pale horse moved with the inevitability of mortality, unstoppable and universal in its reach. The rider of the pale horse was identified by name in John's vision as Death, while closely following behind came another figure called Hades, representing the realm of the dead where all mortal existence ultimately terminates. Together, these two figures were given authority over a fourth part of the earth, empowered to kill through sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts. Their mission was to demonstrate the ultimate futility of human rebellion against divine authority by showing that all earthly power and pride must ultimately yield to the reality of mortality. The pale horse and its dual riders represented the climax of the judgments brought by the four horsemen, the final demonstration that human attempts to create lasting civilizations apart from divine authority must ultimately fail. Death had always been the great equalizer, reducing emperors and slaves to the same condition of dust and decay. Now this universal enemy was being revealed as an instrument of divine justice, serving the purposes of the same God who had created life in the beginning. The weapons employed by Death and Hades' sword, famine, pestilence, and wild beasts represented the complete breakdown of human civilization and its return to primordial chaos. The sword spoke of warfare and violence, famine of economic and agricultural collapse, pestilence of disease and biological breakdown, while wild beasts suggested the reclaiming of human settlements by the natural world. Together, these four instruments would reverse the process of civilization, returning large portions of the earth to conditions that existed before human organization and technology imposed order upon the natural world. The vision of the four horsemen riding across the earth in sequence represented a divine response to human rebellion that was both systematic and complete. Each horseman prepared the way for the next, creating conditions that would make the subsequent judgments both necessary and inevitable. The white horse's conquests would lead to the conflicts brought by the red horse, which in turn would create the scarcities represented by the black horse, ultimately resulting in the widespread death delivered by the pale horse. Yet even these terrible visions of judgment were not ends in themselves, but rather necessary stages in the divine plan for the ultimate restoration of creation. The four horsemen were agents of destruction, but their destruction served the purpose of clearing away the corruption and rebellion that prevented the establishment of divine justice on earth. They represented not the final word of divine judgment, but rather the preparation for a new creation that would emerge from the ashes of the old. The cosmic scope of these visions distinguished them from all previous biblical prophecies, encompassing not merely local or national judgments, but events that would affect all of creation simultaneously. The four horsemen would ride not just through Israel or the Roman Empire, but across the entire earth, their mission extending to every nation and people. This universal scope reflected the global nature of human rebellion against divine authority and the correspondingly comprehensive character of divine judgment. The symbolic nature of the four horsemen has inspired countless interpretations throughout the centuries, with different generations finding in these figures reflections of their own historical experiences. Some have seen in the horsemen representations of specific historical events or periods, while others have interpreted them as eternal principles that manifest themselves repeatedly throughout human history. Still others have understood them as literal prophecies of future events that will culminate human history. What remains constant across all interpretations is the sense that these visions reveal something fundamental about the nature of divine justice and the ultimate destiny of human civilization. The four horsemen represent forces that operate according to spiritual laws rather than merely political or economic ones, demonstrating that there are dimensions of reality that transcend ordinary human understanding and control. The impact of these visions upon John himself was profound and transformative. The aged apostle, who had spent decades proclaiming the love and mercy of God, now found himself witnessing scenes of judgment that revealed the terrible side of divine holiness. Yet even these frightening visions were given to him as revelations of divine love, for they showed that God would not permit evil and rebellion to continue indefinitely, but would ultimately intervene to establish justice and righteousness. As the vision of the four horsemen faded into the swirling mists of prophetic revelation, John understood that he had been granted a glimpse into the ultimate purposes of divine providence. The horsemen were not arbitrary forces of destruction, but instruments of a divine plan that would ultimately result in the restoration of all things to their proper relationship with their Creator. Their terrible ride across the earth was part of a larger story that would conclude not with destruction, but with renewal. The mysteries revealed to John on the island of Patmos connected all the previous supernatural encounters we have explored into a single, coherent vision of divine purpose working through human history. The desperate king seeking guidance from the dead, the prophet receiving visions of divine glory, the empire confronted with supernatural judgment, and the man restored to life from the grave. All these events found their ultimate meaning in the cosmic drama that would culminate with the riding of the four horsemen. Through these interconnected mysteries, we see that the supernatural encounters recorded in biblical history were not isolated phenomena, but manifestations of a divine plan that encompasses all of time and space. Each mystery revealed another aspect of the eternal struggle between divine justice and human rebellion, between the order that comes from submission to divine authority and the chaos that results from human attempts to create meaning and purpose apart from God. The thread that weaves through all these mysteries is the persistent divine initiative to communicate with humanity despite human resistance and rebellion. Whether through the medium at Endor, the visions of Ezekiel, the supernatural writing on Belshazzar's wall, the resurrection of Lazarus, or the apocalyptic revelations given to John, the divine continues to break through the barriers that separate the eternal from the temporal, the spiritual from the physical. As we reflect upon these ancient mysteries in the quiet moments before sleep, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the boundaries of any particular religious tradition or historical period. These stories speak to universal human experiences of mortality, meaning, justice, and hope that resonate across cultures and centuries. They remind us that there are dimensions of reality that extend beyond the material world, mysteries that continue to challenge our understanding and invite our contemplation. The biblical mysteries we have explored tonight serve as windows into a reality that encompasses but transcends our ordinary experience. They suggest that the world we think we know is only a small part of a much larger cosmic drama, one in which spiritual forces operate according to laws that we can glimpse but never fully comprehend. These mysteries invite us to expand our vision beyond the limitations of purely material understanding and to consider the possibility that our lives are part of a story much grander than we typically imagine. In the silence that follows these ancient tales, we find ourselves standing at the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the temporal and the eternal. The mysteries that have unfolded before us tonight continue to echo through time, their meanings deepening with each generation that encounters them. They speak to something within the human spirit that recognizes truth even when it cannot fully understand it, that senses the presence of the divine even in the midst of darkness and uncertainty. These biblical mysteries remain powerful precisely because they address questions that every human being must eventually confront. What lies beyond the boundary of death? Is there justice in the universe? Do our lives have meaning that extends beyond our brief time on earth? The supernatural encounters we have explored offer glimpses of answers to these questions, but they do so in ways that preserve mystery while providing hope. As the night deepens and these ancient stories settle into the landscape of memory and dream, they carry with them the promise that reality is far richer and more meaningful than it might appear on the surface. The mysteries of biblical history continue to speak across the centuries, offering comfort to those who suffer, hope to those who despair, and wonder to all who are willing to look beyond the ordinary boundaries of human experience. The eternal echoes of these mysteries remind us that we are part of a story that began before our birth and will continue long after our death, a cosmic narrative in which every human life plays a significant role. In contemplating these ancient mysteries, we find ourselves connected to the generations who have gone before us and to those who will come after us, all participants in the same grand drama of existence that unfolds according to purposes too vast for any single human mind to comprehend. Tonight, as sleep approaches and consciousness begins to fade, these biblical mysteries continue their work of transformation, planting seeds of wonder and reverence that will grow in the quiet soil of the dreaming mind. They remind us that even in our sleep, we are held within a reality that is far more mysterious and wonderful than our waking minds can fully grasp. Surrounded by love that transcends understanding and protected by purposes that encompass all of creation. The mysteries we have explored together will continue to unfold their meanings in the deep places of the heart, where human understanding touches the edge of divine truth and finds there not answers that satisfy all questions, but rather a peace that surpasses all understanding. In that peace, the ancient mysteries find their ultimate purpose, not in solving the riddles of existence, but in connecting us to the source from which all existence flows. The island of Patmos, with its windswept cliffs and ancient stones, had become more than merely a place of exile for the aged Apostle John. In the months and years following his great vision of the four horsemen, the rocky shores and barren hills had transformed into a sanctuary where the boundary between earth and heaven seemed permanently thinned. Each dawn brought new possibilities for divine revelation. Each sunset carried whispers of eternal truths that ordinary mortals could barely comprehend. John had learned to live in a state of perpetual readiness for the supernatural, his spirit attuned to frequencies that existed beyond normal human perception. The harsh beauty of his island prison had become a cathedral without walls, where every crashing wave served as a hymn, and every star-filled night offered opportunities for communion with the infinite. The Roman authorities had intended Patmos to break his spirit through isolation and hardship, but instead they had created the perfect conditions for the reception of truths that would reshape human understanding of divine purpose. The visions that had been granted to John extended far beyond the dramatic appearance of the four horsemen, encompassing revelations of cosmic scope that revealed the ultimate destiny of all creation. He had been shown cities of gold descending from heaven, seas of glass mingled with fire, and creatures whose very existence challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. These visions came not as isolated experiences, but as parts of a vast tapestry that depicted the entire arc of divine purpose, from creation to consummation. In the quiet hours between his public visions, John often reflected on the connections between what he was witnessing and the earlier mysteries that had shaped biblical history. The hand that had written judgment on Belshazzar's wall was the same hand that would guide the four horsemen across the earth. The voice that had called Lazarus from the tomb would one day speak the words that would reshape all of creation. The divine presence that had appeared to Ezekiel by the river Chebar was the same glory that would eventually fill the earth as the waters cover the sea. These connections were not merely intellectual observations, but profound spiritual insights that transformed John's understanding of his own role in the cosmic drama. He had been chosen not simply to receive visions, but to serve as a bridge between the age that was passing away and the age that was to come. His writings would carry these mysteries forward through time, preserving them for generations who would face their own encounters with the supernatural and need guidance for understanding what they experienced. The mystery of divine timing had become increasingly clear to John during his years of exile. Each of the biblical encounters with the supernatural had occurred at precisely the moment when it would have maximum impact on the unfolding plan of divine purpose. Saul's consultation with the medium at Endor had taken place at the crucial transition between his reign and that of David. Ezekiel's visions had come during the exile when the people needed assurance that their God had not abandoned them. Daniel's interpretation of the writing on the wall had marked the exact moment when one empire was giving way to another. Similarly, John understood that his own visions were coming at a time when the early Christian church needed guidance for navigating the challenges that lay ahead. The Roman Empire's persecution of believers would intensify, false teachers would arise to distort the gospel message, and the passing of the apostolic generation would leave the church without direct witnesses to the earthly ministry of Jesus. The apocalyptic visions granted to John would provide a framework for understanding these difficulties as part of a larger divine plan. The four horsemen that John had witnessed represented more than future judgments. They embodied eternal principles that operated throughout human history. The white horse of conquest reflected the divine determination to establish righteousness on earth, regardless of human resistance. The red horse of war revealed the inevitable conflicts that arise when human pride opposes divine authority. The black horse of famine exposed the spiritual poverty that results from turning away from the source of all sustenance. The pale horse of death demonstrated the ultimate futility of all human attempts to achieve lasting security apart from divine grace. John had come to understand that these horsemen were already riding through the world in his own time, their influence visible to those who had eyes to see the spiritual dimensions of earthly events. The Roman Empire's military conquests reflected the work of the white horse, while the civil wars that periodically convulsed the empire showed the red horse's influence. Economic instability and the growing gap between rich and poor revealed the black horse's activity, while plagues and natural disasters demonstrated the pale horse's presence. Yet even as John recognized these present manifestations of the cosmic forces he had witnessed in vision, he understood that a future consummation awaited when their work would be completed. The riding of the four horsemen was part of a divine plan that encompassed all of history, moving inevitably toward a conclusion that would vindicate divine justice and establish divine mercy as the governing principle of existence. The mystery of suffering had been illuminated for John through his visions in ways that brought both comfort and challenge. He had seen that the trials endured by the faithful were not arbitrary punishments, but necessary preparations for the glory that would be revealed in them. The persecution that had brought him to Patmos was itself part of the divine plan, creating the conditions necessary for him to receive the revelations that would encourage countless future generations of believers. This understanding transformed John's perspective on his own exile from a punishment to be endured into a privilege to be embraced. The isolation that had initially seemed like abandonment was revealed to be divine appointment, positioning him in the perfect location for receiving communications from the eternal realm. The hardships that had threatened to break his spirit became opportunities for spiritual growth that prepared him to comprehend mysteries that would have overwhelmed a less seasoned servant of God. The aged apostle had learned to see his own story as part of the larger narrative that connected all biblical history into a single, coherent account of divine purpose working through human experience. His imprisonment by Roman authorities echoed the experiences of earlier prophets who had suffered for proclaiming divine truth. His visions of future glory connected with the hopes that had sustained the faithful throughout the centuries of waiting for divine intervention. John's reflections on the interconnectedness of biblical mysteries led him to profound insights about the nature of prophetic revelation itself. He understood that the supernatural encounters recorded in Scripture were not random eruptions of divine power into human history, but carefully orchestrated manifestations designed to reveal specific aspects of divine character and purpose. Each mystery built upon previous revelations, adding new layers of understanding while confirming eternal truths that remained constant across all generations. The prophetic gift that had enabled Ezekiel to see the divine chariot was the same spiritual capacity that allowed John to witness the cosmic drama of the four horsemen. The wisdom that had enabled Daniel to interpret the supernatural writing on Belshazzar's wall was the same divine insight that illuminated the meaning of John's apocalyptic visions. The power that had enabled Jesus to call Lazarus from the tomb was the same authority that would ultimately subject all creation to divine will. These connections revealed to John that the biblical mysteries were not isolated phenomena, but expressions of consistent divine character working through changing historical circumstances. The God who had appeared to ancient prophets in visions of fire and cloud was the same God who was revealing himself to John through apocalyptic imagery. The unchanging nature of divine character provided continuity across the centuries, while the varying forms of revelation demonstrated divine creativity in communicating eternal truths to different generations. The mystery of divine patience had become particularly clear to John during his years of receiving visions on Patmos. He had witnessed scenes of terrible judgment and cosmic upheaval, yet he understood that these represented not divine cruelty, but divine mercy expressing itself through necessary correction. The delay between the announcement of judgment and its execution reflected not divine weakness, but divine love, providing opportunities for repentance and restoration. This understanding helped John comprehend why the four horsemen had not yet completed their final ride across the earth. The divine patience that had delayed judgment in previous generations was still operating, providing humanity with additional time to turn from rebellion and embrace the salvation that had been purchased through divine sacrifice. The visions of future judgment served not primarily as threats, but as warnings designed to motivate present repentance. John had observed this pattern of divine patience throughout biblical history. The warning given to Belshazzar through the supernatural writing on the wall had come during a night when repentance might still have averted disaster. The visions granted to Ezekiel had been accompanied by calls for national repentance that could have prevented the judgment that eventually fell upon Jerusalem. Even Saul's encounter with the spirit of Samuel had included implicit invitations to humble submission that might have changed the course of events. The consistency of divine character across these various supernatural encounters provided John with confidence that the visions he was receiving accurately reflected eternal truths rather than temporary circumstances. The God who had revealed himself to previous generations through dreams, visions, and miraculous interventions was the same God who was now unveiling the ultimate destiny of creation through apocalyptic revelation. John's growing understanding of these connections had transformed his approach to interpreting the visions he received. Rather than viewing each revelation as an isolated communication, he learned to see them as parts of a larger conversation that God had been conducting with humanity since the beginning of time. This perspective enabled him to discern patterns and principles that might not have been apparent if he had focused only on the immediate content of individual visions. The mystery of divine timing became increasingly significant as John reflected on the spacing of supernatural revelations throughout biblical history. Long periods of apparent silence were followed by intensive seasons of prophetic activity, suggesting that divine communications followed patterns that reflected divine wisdom rather than human expectations. The concentration of supernatural encounters during times of crisis and transition indicated that these revelations served specific purposes in the unfolding of divine plans. John recognized that his own period of receiving visions corresponded to one of these crucial transition times in divine purpose. The apostolic age was ending, the Christian church was spreading throughout the Roman Empire, and new challenges were arising that would require fresh revelations of divine truth. The apocalyptic visions he was receiving would provide the church with guidance for navigating these challenges while maintaining hope for ultimate divine victory. The symbolic language that characterized John's visions connected them with the prophetic traditions that extended back through biblical history to the earliest supernatural encounters. The use of symbolic imagery rather than literal description reflected the difficulty of communicating transcendent truths through human language, requiring metaphors and analogies that could point toward realities that exceeded ordinary human experience. John had learned to interpret these symbols not as puzzles to be solved, but as windows through which eternal truths could be glimpsed by those who approached them with faith and humility. The four horsemen were not simply literal riders on literal horses, but personifications of spiritual forces that operated according to divine purposes. Their symbolic representation made them accessible to human understanding while preserving the mystery that surrounded their ultimate nature and operation. The aged apostle's deepening appreciation for the symbolic dimensions of prophetic revelation had enhanced his ability to discern connections between his visions and earlier biblical mysteries. The supernatural hand that had written on Belshazzar's wall had employed symbolic language that required interpretation, just as John's visions employed symbolic imagery that pointed towards spiritual realities. The consistency of this approach across centuries of prophetic revelation suggested that symbolic communication was an essential characteristic of divine revelation to humanity. John's reflections on these matters had led him to understand that the biblical mysteries served multiple purposes in the divine economy. They provided specific guidance for immediate circumstances, while also revealing eternal principles that remained relevant across all generations. They demonstrated divine power while also revealing divine character. They challenged human understanding while also providing hope for ultimate comprehension. The mystery of divine love had been illuminated for John through his contemplation of how supernatural revelations had functioned throughout biblical history. Even the most terrifying visions of judgment were motivated by divine love, seeking to preserve what could be saved and restore what had been corrupted. The four horsemen themselves, despite their fearsome appearance, were agents of a divine love that refused to permit evil to triumph permanently over good. This understanding transformed John's perspective on his own sufferings and those of his fellow believers. The persecution that had brought him to Patmos was part of the same divine love that had permitted earlier prophets to endure hardship for the sake of preserving divine truth for future generations. The visions of future tribulation that he was receiving were expressions of divine love, providing advance warning and preparation for challenges that lay ahead. John had come to see that the thread connecting all biblical mysteries was not merely divine power, but divine love expressing itself through various forms of supernatural intervention. The desperation that had driven Saul to consult the medium at Endor had been met by divine love providing guidance even through forbidden means. The exile that had seemed to separate Ezekiel from divine presence had been transformed by divine love into an opportunity for unprecedented revelation. The apparent delay in Jesus' response to the death of Lazarus had been an expression of divine love preparing for a greater demonstration of divine power. The consistency of divine love across these various supernatural encounters provided John with assurance that the future revelations he was receiving, however terrifying in their immediate content, were ultimately expressions of the same divine love that had sustained the faithful throughout all previous generations. The cosmic scope of the judgments he witnessed in vision reflected not divine hatred, but divine love, refusing to permit corruption and rebellion to permanently disfigure creation. As John contemplated these profound connections between past, present, and future expressions of divine purpose, he found himself overwhelmed by a sense of privilege at being chosen to serve as a conduit for such extraordinary revelations. The isolation of Patmos had become a sacred trust, providing him with the solitude necessary to receive and record communications that would guide and encourage believers until the end of time. The responsibility that accompanied this privilege was equally overwhelming. John understood that the visions he was receiving were not intended for his private edification, but for the instruction and encouragement of the entire Christian community across all subsequent generations. The accuracy with which he recorded and interpreted these revelations would affect the faith and hope of countless future believers who would look to his writings for guidance during their own encounters with the supernatural. This sense of responsibility had motivated John to approach his prophetic calling with extraordinary care and humility. He recognized that human language was inherently inadequate for describing transcendent realities, yet he was committed to preserving the essential content of his visions with complete fidelity to what he had witnessed. The symbolic language he employed was not an attempt to obscure divine truth, but rather the most accurate means available for communicating experiences that exceeded ordinary human categories of understanding. John's growing appreciation for the continuity of divine purpose across biblical history had also deepened his understanding of his own role in the apostolic mission. He was not merely the last surviving apostle, but the apostle specifically chosen to receive and transmit the final revelations that would complete the biblical canon. His longevity had not been accidental but providential, preserving him for the unique role of bridging the apostolic age with the age of the church that would follow. The visions that continued to come to John on Patmos revealed not only future events, but also the ultimate meaning of all previous supernatural encounters recorded in biblical history. The mysteries that had puzzled earlier generations would find their resolution in the cosmic drama that was yet to unfold. The questions raised by supernatural interventions in human affairs would receive their answers in the divine actions that would bring history to its appointed conclusion. This perspective enabled John to see his own visions not as additions to biblical revelation, but as the culmination toward which all previous revelations had been pointing. The supernatural encounters that had marked crucial moments in biblical history were preview glimpses of the ultimate supernatural intervention that would transform all of creation according to divine purposes. The four horsemen were not merely symbols of future judgment, but representations of the divine authority that had been operating throughout history and would finally establish its complete dominion over all things. The aged apostle's reflections on these matters had brought him to a profound appreciation for the patience and wisdom that characterized divine providence. The centuries that had elapsed between the first promises of divine intervention and their ultimate fulfillment reflected not divine forgetfulness, but divine wisdom, providing the time necessary for all aspects of the divine plan to reach their proper culmination. The delays that had frustrated human expectations were part of a divine timing that ensured the perfect coordination of all elements in the cosmic drama. John had learned to see human history not as a random sequence of events, but as a carefully orchestrated progression toward predetermined goals. The supernatural encounters that punctuated this progression served as both guides and encouragements, providing humanity with glimpses of the divine purposes that gave meaning to temporal existence. Each mystery revealed another aspect of the divine character, while their cumulative effect provided a comprehensive portrait of the God who governed all things according to perfect wisdom and love. The connections that John perceived between his apocalyptic visions and earlier biblical mysteries had convinced him that divine revelation possessed an internal consistency that transcended the changing circumstances of different historical periods. The same divine character that had been revealed through the supernatural encounters of ancient times was being revealed through the visions he was receiving on Patmos. This consistency provided him with confidence that his interpretations of present revelations were grounded in eternal truths rather than temporary perspectives. As the sun set over the Aegean Sea and another day of divine communion drew to its close, John found himself filled with a sense of completion that transcended his physical circumstances. The mysteries that had been revealed to him connected his own experience with the great chain of divine revelation that extended back to the beginning of biblical history and forward to the end of time. He understood that he had been privileged to witness the culmination of a conversation between heaven and earth that had been in progress since the creation of the world. The rocky shores of Patmos had become for John a window into eternity, a place where the temporal and eternal intersected in ways that revealed the ultimate unity underlying all apparent diversity. The supernatural encounters that had shaped biblical history were not isolated phenomena, but manifestations of a single divine purpose that encompassed all of creation and would ultimately triumph over every form of opposition. In the gathering darkness of another Mediterranean evening, John prepared for sleep with the knowledge that his dreams might carry him into further visions of divine glory. The boundary between waking and sleeping had become increasingly irrelevant as his consciousness had been attuned to receive communications from the eternal realm. Whether through visions, dreams, or direct spiritual insight, the divine continued to unfold its mysteries to the aged apostle who had been chosen to serve as the final witness to the apostolic generation. The mysteries that had been revealed to John would continue to unfold their meanings across the centuries, providing guidance and hope for countless generations of believers who would face their own encounters with the supernatural. The four horsemen would ride again in the experiences of those who witnessed divine judgment in their own times, while the promises of ultimate restoration would sustain those who suffered for their faith in ages yet to come. And so, as these biblical mysteries fade into the gentle darkness of approaching sleep, they leave behind not conclusions, but invitations, not explanations, but wonder, not endings, but the promise of continuations that stretch beyond the horizon of human sight into the infinite mystery of divine love that encompasses all things and holds all things together in perfect harmony. The echoes of ancient revelations continue to resonate through time, carrying forward the assurance that reality is far more mysterious and wonderful than our finite understanding can fully grasp, and that even in our deepest sleep, we remain held within purposes too vast and loving for any human mind to completely comprehend.